Elsecar is considered one of England's first model villages. The name is thought to come from an Old English name, Ealfsig, and the Old English word ciar, meaning marsh or brushwood. It started as a simple street village on Wath Road, with the hamlet of Elsecar Green centred around what is the corner of Milton Hall and Wentworth and Wath Road. It was mainly rural for its existence, but the Barnsley seam of coal underneath the village is what made it what it is today. It is believed, however, there was coal being dug up in the nearby forest from even as early as the 1500s. The hamlet was purchased by the Watson Wentworths in the 1700s, and this is where Elsecar's coal mine story truly began. Located off Wentworth Road near the Elsecar Heritage Centre car park is the Footrail, which was once the entrance to the collieries in Elsecar in the 1700s. The wall is made of dressed sandstone, and the tunnel which would have led to the Barnsley seam is ashlar lined. Lawwood Colliery, or Lowood Colliery as it was also known, dates back to 1723. This would have led them to an inclined path that took people down to the pit, although it's most likely that this would have been the entrance for visiting royalty or aristocracy who were being taken around by the owners of the colliery. Elsecar Colliery, which then became known as Elsecar High Colliery and Elsecar Old Colliery, was sunk around 1750 by Richard Bingley. In the 1750s, both Lowood and Elsecar Colliery were under the ownership of the Wentworth estates. Elsecar coal was transported by horse-drawn wagon, but Lowood Colliery was transported to a wharf on the River Don in Kilnhurst. In the 1770s, only 5 people worked at the Elsecar Colliery, and only 7 worked at Lowood. In 1757, Elsecar Colliery comprised of 15-metre deep pits around Elsecar Green. When the second Marquess of Rockingham died in 1782 and the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam inherited his estates, Elsecar Old Colliery was expanded and the Earl installed steam winding engines in 1796. In 1828, the Duke of Clarence, later King William IV, was taken on an underground tour of Elsecar Old Colliery, the first time a royal had done something like this. In 1848, 87 men and boys were working at the pit. However, in 1888, the reserves were exhausted and Elsecar Old Colliery was closed. On the 1st of July 1782, Charles Watson Wentworth, who owned the Wentworth estates, died and passed his estates to the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam. The Earl then proceeded to expand Elsecar's industry even further. On the 5th of July 1794, the sinking of Elsecar New Colliery began, with 2 shafts descending nearly 130 feet to reach the Barnsley seam, which was considered quite deep at the time. By 1798, a 3rd shaft had been added, and the coal output was 12,000 tonnes. In 1825, it was 48,000 tonnes, and it had a workforce of 105 men and boys. Then, after 1836, another shaft was added at Jump, known locally as Jump Pit. However, in 1842, a man named Michael Daly was accidentally killed where the wagons that linked Jump Pit to Elsecar New Colliery ran over him when he fell over. Then, in 1795, the Newcomen type beam engine was installed. It is believed that it could pump 386 gallons of water per minute and run for 10 hours straight. The engine house has a Welsh slated gable roof. It's made of local coursed sandstone. The timber was from the Earl's woodland at Wentworth, and the pipes were from the Park Ironworks in Sheffield. In 1812, it was believed it could actually then pull 604 gallons of water per minute and run for 16 hours a day as well. Renamed Elsecar Mid Colliery in 1848, Elsecar New Colliery ceased production in the mid-1850s after activity moved to Simonwood and Hemmingfield collieries. The Newcomen type beam engine continued pumping until 1923. In 1927, however, Henry Ford actually came and offered a blank cheque to try and purchase the engine and move it back to the USA, but the Earl refused. In 1928, it pumped once more in an emergency. However, it had its final steaming in 1951. It was scheduled as a monument in 1973 and reopened to the public in 2014. The story goes that Hemmingfield gets its name from a Viking called Hemming who made his settlement here. Hemmingfield Colliery, also known as Elsecar Low Colliery, began sinking in 1842. They finally struck the black gold in 1848. It also had its own connection to the Dove and Dearne Canal, called the Hemmingfield Basin. Hemmingfield Colliery consisted of 2 downcast shafts, a winding shaft and a pumping shaft, and 1 upcast shaft, which was to aid with ventilation, and another shaft was added in 1864-5. In 1847, Irishman John Hunt fell down the winding shaft. In 1852, an explosion killed 10 miners and injured 12 more. In 1853, a 10-year-old fell into the machinery and was killed. At least 19 others were killed whilst it was an active colliery, with the last being Arthur Utley in 1918. In 1926, however, James Penty died in a cage accident. New ventilation shafts were installed and a new pit headgear was put up in August 1883 to replace the old wooden one. In 1869, Hemmingfield Colliery was producing 500 tonnes of coal a day, making it the most productive of all the 3 Elsecar collieries. When the original manager, Benjamin Biram, died in 1857, management duties were passed on to John Hartop. When he retired in 1886, it was then taken over by Thomas Newbold, who remained there until Hemmingfield Colliery ceased coal production in 1920. Then the South Yorkshire Pumping Association took over the site. Their electric pumps could deal with over 600 gallons of water a minute. After 1978, the site was managed from Silverwood Colliery until pumping stopped in 1989. In the early 2000s, the site had become overgrown and was subject to antisocial behaviour. Then, in 2014, the purchase of the site by the Friends of Hemmingfield Colliery was finalised, who have carried out extensive restoration work and care for the site today. The next and penultimate colliery opened up in Elsecar was the Simon Wood Colliery. It reached the Barnsley seam at 93 yards in 1853. It shares its name with the nearby Simon Wood, which was owned by the Earl Fitzwilliam. It was also known locally as the Planting Pit, although the media accidentally referred to it as the Plantain Pit. It saw numerous deaths, this colliery, including in 1878 the death of a boy named George Blankley, who was crushed to death by an empty coal tub. Then in 1888 a man named John Guest was crushed by coal, and the next year a man named John White was killed in the same manner. 50 years after it reached the Barnsley bed, Simonwood Colliery ceased production. The final colliery sunk in Elsecar was Elsecar Main Colliery. Sinking took place between 1905 and 1908. It reached the Park Gate seam at nearly 350 yards and was deepened in 1924 and 5. It also worked the Thorncliffe seam in 1937, the Haymore seam in 1943 and Silkstone by 1945. Pithead baths were installed in 1938 and it had its own power provided by 10 Lancashire boilers. 53-year-old Thomas Archdale is believed to have been the pit's first casualty in 1909, having been killed by a roof collapse. The youngest was Harry Drury at 16 years old, who fell and fractured his skull. The last is believed to have been 62-year-old James Harding in 1953. King George V and Queen Mary visited Elsecar Main Colliery in 1912 and was shown the underground workings by Thomas Newbold. King George was the first reigning monarch to go down a coal pit. In 1923 it saw its peak of workers with a reported 2,400 people working here. In 1967 it had an output of 1.3 million tonnes of coal. Ultimately, however, Elsecar Main Colliery closed in 1983 and the surface plant was demolished in 1985, bringing to an end Elsecar's largest employer and indeed the end of Elsecar's nearly 260-year-long coal story. Elsecar can be proud of its coal mining heritage. Coal was vital to the development of Britain, and Elsecar played a very big part of that. The families at Wentworth Woodhouse helped build this village up as part of their industrial empire, with at least 20 collieries within a 4-mile radius of Wentworth Woodhouse. Whilst the industry is in the past, there is a visitor centre there today, lovely walks available, and places to grab a bite to eat. Elsecar has a fantastic community today, and a bright future too.